We're live. So, do you want to introduce the theme of the day and the author?
Absolutely. Welcome back to the final exposition. This week we have Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl was an Austro-Hungarian psychiatrist who was born in 1905. So he lived through 2 world wars. He is in the present remembered for being one of the founders of approaches of humanistic psychotherapy and of existential psychotherapy, which is sort of his trademark. He lives on as an influencer of newer forms of psychotherapy that are less rigid and less inspired by the Freudian psychodynamic world, and they're not really cognitive behavioral. So he's a very, very holistic, I would say he's an ancestor to a holistic way of thinking and looking at therapy. And yeah, he wrote this book, Man's Search for Meaning, among various other books. This is his most influential work. It sold a lot of copies. I don't know exactly how many, but it sold a lot of copies. And it's basically one of the standard works, I think, if you're interested in psychology and the psychology of meaning, to get into. So yeah.
And absolutely agree. So the main theme of the book, you could almost say it's 2 books in one actually. The first part of the book takes on Frankl's experiences in the concentration camps, specifically Auschwitz and Dachau. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Yeah, perfect. Okay. The second part of the book, he's outlining his logotherapy, which is sort of a, like Nick was saying, it's taking on some Freudian ideas, but distinctifying himself from that. So that's a very brief summary of what's happening. I think it's best if we just go directly into the themes to kind of extrapolate from there. Do you want to start us off?
Yeah, sure. I would like to. So obviously the book is called Man's Search for Meaning. So his main concern and his main argument in the book revolves around how humans find the meaning that sustains them throughout their lifetime. So how we can find purpose in the things we do every day, and why don't we just, jump off a bridge every day because life is so inherently horrible. So my question for you is, in how far, his first premise is that life is suffering, right? So life is inherently filled with suffering.
Very Buddhist right. Sort of trajectory taking on there, so yeah.
So in how far would you say he fits into the canon, let's say, of existential thinkers like Sartre, like Kierkegaard?
So it's very interesting. When I was reading this, Frankl spends a lot of time sort of introducing the idea you have to find meaning and purpose in your existence. And he puts in a very interesting, later on, and it's actually in the second part of this book, he talks about, he's counseling a rabbi basically, and the rabbi can't have children because his new wife is infertile, and he's trying to say, well, why can't I have meaning now? Where's the meaning in my life? And Frankl basically says, well, there's more to life than children, basically. So, but we have to recognize with Frankl specifically, he is associating meaning from his perspective within the concentration camps, where it's almost the greatest level of suffering a human being can endure. And we do need to remind ourselves that Frankl's perspective is directly his experiences of suffering in that way. So in terms of how it sits and situates itself in the broader idea of, well, let me sort of cut that back a bit actually, because Frankl is clear that you don't need to suffer to have meaning. He makes that point pretty clean at the later stages of the book. But you can find meaning in spite of suffering is the key theme I take from the book.
So if we compare it to, for example, Kierkegaard, Aryn Kierkegaard, who writes about that life is despair and nothing apart from despair and suffering, Frankl says there is actually a way that you can live without suffering and still have meaning in your life.
Yeah.
But when push comes to shove, that meaning that you find is the thing that will sustain you through the suffering.
It's very interesting because readers of Sartre, for example, particularly Nausea, which is sort of the existential book of books for many readers, that would be Jean-Paul Sartre's seminal work, Nausea. There's a key quote in that where it says, well, I'll paraphrase quite heavily here, but the human is the one that pulls themselves out of the mire, in a sense, creating their own meaning. I'm not sure Frankl would totally agree with that, though, because I do get this sense of community, this communal idea within Frankl that it's a little bit more than just individualized. He makes a point of saying meaning is an individual thing, it's not abstract, which we can get onto in a moment because I disagree with him, but but in a sense, the meaning, it's not just suffering. It's you don't just draw yourself out of the mire.
So yeah, this is, I think, one of the major points of departure for Frankl compared to a lot of modern thinkers or postmodern thinkers that construct and deconstruct meaning in their discourse analysis and stuff. Frankl, as I understand him at least, says meaning is nothing that you can find it, but you don't construct it. So it is out there in the world, you just have to search for it. So it's a little bit of like Heideggerian in a sense, right? Who is like, Heidegger was a very big supporter of the National Socialists, but also a phenomenological thinker who said that things shine forth towards you, right? So if something is rich and if something grabs your attention, if something is meaningful to you, it will show itself, but that doesn't mean that you construct it. It sort of finds you.
So I would have a question. Do you agree with Frankl that meaning is not abstract? Because at least in the way I read him, he's trying to find an individualized purpose that can be sort of extrapolated through community and things like that. But at the same time, it's not abstract.
Yes.
It's something that is tangible, something that is, in a sense, almost touchable.
Yes. So I think a big theme, so I would agree with him in a certain way that it's not abstract. I mean, obviously, people find meaning in a variety of different things, depending on their background, depending on their political, ideas and what they want to see in the world, what they want to see in themselves. You can construct that in a variety of ways. But as we touched last week, I think, and you tell me what you think about this, it's like there is an underlying pattern of how meaning is constructed that is not in and of itself individualistic. And that would be the motive of the self-overcoming. We talked about struggle last week with Karl Marx as an example. The self-overcoming, which is central to Frankl's logotherapy.
Absolutely. And I mean, I appreciate where Frankl's coming from in many ways, because he's directing this idea that, to find meaning, you need to individualize it in a sense. You can't just abstract it and put your meaning into abstract things, because then it's very interpretive on what that abstraction is. So in a sense, I agree with him there. I just am concerned when it comes to the idea of people put meaning into things like God, for example. God is an abstract. They might represent God in terms of something tangible, something that they relate to. They meaning an individual, really. But this idea of meaning becomes very interpretive. I don't get a strong sense that meaning in of itself is tangible. I get more of a sense that the type of meaning that Frankl's talking about is an interpretive meaning, because that seems central to the idea of logotherapy.
So can you elaborate a little bit on what you mean with interpretive meaning?
Well, Wittgenstein had a big problem with Freud. The main problem Wittgenstein had with Freud was that he sort of inferred that Freud was being too interpretive with psychoanalysis, basically. And that at some point it became unclear whether it was the analyst's interpretation or the one being analyzed. And this is where I'd have a slight issue with Frankl's sort of logotherapy specifically, is at what point is it Frankl's interpretation of meaning, and at what point is it actually the client or the person sitting in the chair, their interpretation of meaning? because there must be a distinction there somewhere, but there is a sense of abstraction. Because if now you tell me your meaning, and let's say I take on that meaning and that becomes my meaning, is it, I mean, he makes a huge point of free will in this book. At what point is that, in a sense, my meaning as it is to me, or the meaning that I have taken because of my encounter with you?
So if I would try to translate that into a situation in psychotherapy, if you get psychoanalyzed, I mean, roughly speaking, we're not experts, but
not at all.
If we're roughly speaking in a psychoanalytic process, the analyst has a certain formula. So he views your minds as let's say the superego, the ego, and the id, to speak in classical Freudian terms. And there's unconscious processes, I think there's conscious processes. And the analyst takes all of the information about your life that you give to him and interprets or gives you back an interpretation in these terms that you then take on to deal with your problems in your life. And so the point you're raising is in how far is this the meaning or the worldview that the individual goes out with that is getting therapized, in how far is it their own worldview and how far is it the...
Yeah, absolutely.
So in how far is it objective or just
I would be just clear, I'm not making the suggestion that the type of process wouldn't be helpful.
Yes.
I'm not doing that at all. I'm just concerned to what extent is the individual being replaced by somebody who has a more powerful individual in terms of not authoritarian, but in terms of a position of power. As we're sitting here, we're equals.
Yes.
But when you're sitting in the chair in therapy, you're not being represented as an equal. I don't think that relationship is truly there.
I think that is a very valid point, and it is one of the big criticisms that you can bring again a lot of psychotherapeutic approaches which is a big criticism, is that you change the personality, right? You change the personality of a human being according to a certain system of thought.
Yes.
In this case, logotherapy.
Yeah.
And it's absolutely valid. Now, the thing is that individuals who usually go to therapy are in such dire needs because their personality doesn't function properly for themselves and for their society, that you give them an alternative framework of how to sort themselves and how to sort their psyche, and that is better than the framework they used before. But I see the danger that you're referring to. And I definitely see that.
I mean, if to put it into the context of the book itself, Frankl's gone through this horrifying experience. I mean, there's no other way of putting it, the Holocaust. I mean...
It's like as dark as it gets, basically.
And let's say, I'm not, just for absolute clarity, I'm not a psychotherapist and psychology isn't my field, but let's just hypothetically say I'm the one in the chair doing the psychoanalytic part here. And the person in the chair has gone through the Holocaust and I have not. How am I able to, in that way, relate meaning where I have not gone through that? I have not experienced this trauma, this type of trauma. I'm working through a formulaic process at that point. Based on, obviously, there's lots of literature, there's lots of studies that sort of feed into this richness of psychoanalysis, but at the same time, it is formulaic in a sense. It has to be to get, I suppose, in a sense, the maximum amount of effect out of it. But there is that crucial point where I have no idea of the experience the individual in the chair has gone through, not realistically. I may have other experiences that can relate to that, and certainly other studies that I can pull from. But to what extent, what I'm trying to get at is, to what extent do you think that actually colours the process itself?
I think it does colour the process, as we outlined earlier. I would, however, add to that. So what you're saying is you get therapeutic advice from somebody who has a radically different lived experience than yourself.
Yeah.
And I would say that even though a lot of psychotherapists and psychologists have somewhat of a background with mental illness themselves, either in the family or in themselves and all of that, in the last analysis, the experience of each individual is idiosyncratic to themselves, right? So you always talk with somebody who has a different pool of experience than you. Even if you read a book and you get influenced by a book, you read something that was not written by yourself. So in that case, I wouldn't see such a worry with it. Now, the other thing is, with a mind such as Frankls, who was obviously very, very smart, maybe he was able to gather knowledge and to gather a system of thought that is able to even sustain you in the most horrific circumstances a human being can be in, which is being, well, killed and slave work in a concentration camp. So if he's able to provide a framework of meaning that he reports from that place, that surely must be applicable to a situation that is way more relaxed and way less inherently filled with suffering.
Yeah, I would agree to an extent with that. I think there was a point I would want to raise specifically in the context of the book, where Frankl's talking about meaning in terms of suffering exactly. He, I'll have to be a little bit careful in how I word this because I don't want it to come across ingenuously. But in a sense, the survival in the concentration camp, so to find meaning in such dire circumstances, and as you quite rightly put, lots of people that are going for therapy are in dire circumstances in one way or another. It might not be to the extent that you'd find in a concentration camp, but that doesn't mean that their lived experiences aren't manifesting in such a significant or parallel or similar way. So
sure.
But there is this question that Frankl raises about not giving up. And on reading it, I had to read it a few times, because on first reading, where he sort of outlines this idea of not giving up, of trying to find meaning, that those won't be those who have no meaning, as he quotes. He likes to quote Nietzsche a lot, actually, which is very fascinating. Tolstoy and Dostoevsky as well.
We can get into that.
Yeah, I think it's very, very key, actually, that he does. But the point I'm making is he's not quite provoking a sense that the people that gave up in the concentration camps, or people that give up in therapy, but there is this sense that you need to find your meaning, otherwise you've got nothing. And I have a counterpoint I would want to make to that. And I don't think that's strictly true, and I don't think it would have been strictly true in the concentration camps either. This is why I say I wanted to be careful with how I'm wording this. Because in a sense, you're familiar with the trolley problem, right?
No. Can you please elaborate?
Yeah, okay. So again, I don't want to take up all the time in this conversation, so I'll try and make it as quickly as possible. The trolley problem is basically a moral problem that philosophers came up with. And it's essentially, you as the individual, there are one person is tied on a track, and then you have a separate track with 5 people or something tied onto it, and there's a train coming. And you have the choice to pull the switch and decide which track it goes onto. It's a classic paradigmatic moral problem. The solution, very much in inverted commas, the solution that people just came up with is that you step out. You don't play the game because you recognize it is a game and you don't play it. It's not a solution because people are still going to die on that train one way or another. So I would always challenge this idea of a solution. The reason why I'm bringing up this idea is that the people that are giving up in this situation, who's to say that they're just not willing to play the game anymore? Frankl does present this idea of this concentration camp as a game of numbers. It's very interesting how, I don't mean that in a morbidly interesting case, but it's fascinating in a sense that people were reduced to a number in the concentration camp. Their entire humanity deconstructed, devolved, destroyed, so that they're just a number. So it's a numbers game in many ways. And Frankl seems to be outlining this process that those who had the will, those who had found the meaning to continue in this horrific situation, survived. But what of those that didn't? But not because they gave up, but just simply decided, I'm not going to play the game. I sense a very distinctive difference that I don't think Frankl is quite brought out there.
Yeah, okay. So, first of all, I would quickly give an example of what you just outlined with the giving up, and then I would come back to that point.
Yeah.
So, he describes the case, and I'm not 100% sure if I have this correctly anymore, but he describes the case of a patient who had a dream that he will be freed on a certain date, which is like 1.5 months away, right? So this patient had a vision, and the vision is on, I think it's the end of March or the end of April or something, I'm going to be freed, right? And this date comes and goes, and the man is not freed and is very, very destroyed by it, and in the next 2 days he dies. So that is what Frankl means when he says that people who gave up, who didn't have anything to aspire towards anymore, they were the ones that fell victim.
Yeah.
Now,
to their circumstance.
Yeah. Now, Frankl also elaborates quite deeply on the cases that you have made. He says in the beginning of the book, or in the relative beginning of the book, the best of us haven't made it.
No, I absolutely appreciate that.
So
yes.
there is people, and he outlines that, and that is something that he has in common with Solzhenitsyn quite a lot.
Yes.
From the Gulag Archipelago. He describes how people who actually have a lot of meaning and a lot of purpose in their life stand up to this situation and say, no, I'm not taking this.
Yeah.
Do what you want.
Yeah.
I'm not playing your rigid game.
I absolutely agree.
And most of them weren't able to survive.
But then that does, not to interrupt you, but that does raise a problem though, because then the inherency of meaning is kind of like those who are willing to stand up for meaning, for the sake of meaning, perish. So you would almost require a lesser significant meaning to survive in a sense.
So Frankl, that's why he's such a holistic thinker and people love him. And it's also one of the flaws, unfortunately, with a holistic approach to everything. And I think he shares a lot of that with Nietzsche, but we can get into that for a second. Fundamentally, he says, if you have a lot of meaning and you're in a dire situation, you can die. If you don't have a lot of meaning, you can die. There's no guarantee for anything.
Yeah.
But, and that is the point he's making, and I think that is a value point, if you have meaning in your life, you will accept the fate that you're going to have. Doesn't matter the circumstances.
Yes.
And so, for him, in this book, death is not the failure.
No.
The failure is giving up. Right?
I agree with him on principle, absolutely. It's just where I find the distinctions. I think you've outlined it really well, actually, but it's just there are points within that distinction I don't think it's clear. In other words, whether the person has given up or whether they have just gone, I'm not playing the game. There's no clear distinction between it. It's very, very difficult to try and as a post-analysis to go, oh, this is what happened.
I mean, and that is, if you look, so I've looked a little bit into the meaning research that exists nowadays. There's questionnaires and there's all these kind of things. Yeah. Meaning is a construct similar to consciousness. It's very difficult to pinpoint, right? Yeah. And it's very difficult to determine the borders. What is meaningful? What is not meaningful? What is a sense of meaning? It's like, I think we can't argue away, similar to consciousness, its existence. Yeah. You can't say that something like purpose doesn't exist. Anybody who's ever felt to have a purpose or to have a meaning that sustains them in their life knows exactly what that emotion is and can relate to it. Mm-hmm. It's difficult to really lay it out objectively and make it strict borders. And that is why I sort of... So, I'm going off on a tangent. But
can we try for a moment, actually? Yes. Because I thought that Frankl uses a wonderful analogy in the later part. He asks the grandmaster, the chess grandmaster, what's the greatest move in chess? And obviously the chess, well, there is no great move. It's entirely dependent on the situation.
Exactly.
However, as with all analogies, they tend to break down when you start to attack them a bit. So even the analogy I'm going to present now breaks down if you're going to attack it even more. But yeah. I'm a musician, so I play the guitar. What is the objective meaning and purpose of playing a guitar, right? Well, a person could be like, right, I'm going to play the guitar because I want to use the guitar to mash potatoes with. You could absolutely use a guitar to do that. But is that its inherency, meaning, and purpose of the guitar?
Yes. Okay.
Perhaps not. But that's not to detract to say that is one way of doing it. But I would argue, objectively, most people are going to pick up the guitar because they want to play music.
Mm-hmm.
So in the idea of saying there isn't a perfect move, I would go, no, there is actually a perfect move. It's just now you're applying context to it.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that. I would say it still depends on context. Because if you have a serial killer coming into your house and you have a guitar in your hand, what is the purpose of the guitar?
Well, then it's a weapon, of course.
Exactly.
Or you could serenade him in a song, but...
if you're able to play that well, then you can also convince the serial killer.
Pied Piper style thinking, yeah, but...
No, but definitely, I mean, like, I think that is sort of the point he's making, and you can...
Yeah.
Obviously, there is still an order of things, like, there is things that are more associated with the instrument that you want to play than other things. You have a quasi-objective order of things,
yes,
but context is still an incredibly important factor. And
I agree. That's why meaning can change according to context, but what I'm trying to sort of do is almost have a meta-context. In a sense, you may have a contextual representation of your meaning, so
yes,
meaning per circumstance,
yes,
but sitting above that is a higher meaning, a higher purpose, and which you formulate your entire life around.
So let's get to that higher notion
Right.
of meaning. Let's get to Frankl and Nietzsche.
Okay, brilliant.
Because I think that is where this is going. Frankl, very similarly to Friedrich Nietzsche, outlines, I pronounce him English, like I pronounce Friedrich Nietzsche English, that is so weird. But he outlines this core motive of life and of man, of self-overcoming.
Yes.
Right? So you want to further yourself, you want to, I think Frankl calls it self-actualization,
Yes.
which is still a very commonly used term to describe furthering of oneself and all of that.
Self-improvement.
Self-improvement,
you can think in
right.
terms of new, well, not New Ageism, but sort of self-enlightenment, things like that. It
Yeah.
follows the same structural concept.
Right, so that's what he puts as the meta meaning,
Yeah.
right? Would you agree on that first of all?
I agree, yes.
So how do you think it's valid to say the goal is, because it sort of touches on the topics we had with Brave New World,
Yeah.
you know, so the furthering of consciousness. It's like, he doesn't say it's the furthering of consciousness, he says it's the overcoming of your older self.
Yeah.
It's like... Yeah.
So, I mean, we do change as individuals. Consciously, we evolve to a certain extent. The way I was, say, 20 years ago is not how I am now. But I would still track that back a bit and say my overarching sort of meaning hasn't changed.
Mm-hmm.
That's still the same. So I would resist this idea that meaning essentially of itself evolves. In a sense, to use an analogy, a light may shine in a dark room, and it illuminates the room. And if you sort of, the further you put the light away, the darker the room appears, but yet the light hasn't stopped shining. I mean, obviously that's a theological analogy, but at the same time, same as consciousness, I don't think it ever changes.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's always there. It's just our attitude to it changes.
So, okay, so this is very interesting and would get you in a lot of trouble, I think, in a lot of philosophy
of
classes.
course.
Because
I always get in trouble in philosophy places, but yes.
what you fundamentally pose, which I agree with, is an essentialism. An essentialism of self that exists across instances.
Yes.
So, right. So now let's bring that back to Nietzsche and Frankl. Let's say that the self that exists across instances is the self that is overcoming itself.
I would also say it's the self recognizing its externality.
Yes.
So it's internalizing itself in many ways. It's recognizing itself as an individual outside of the external influences that has been imposed upon it. So Frankl's, when he's talking about finding meaning, he's talking about finding it externally. He actually even mentions not trying to internalize that meaning.
Mm-hmm.
I invert that the other way around, personally. I think meaning has to be internalized It has to be removed from the externalization and say, I have this meaning regardless of what's happening around me in many ways. Frankl might have actually agreed with that a little bit, but I would disagree in a sense. Well, that sort of revolves around my core beliefs, of course, and this idea that meaning is, in a sense, objective. I do think there is an objective meaning to life, to existence, and that while we have individual contexts, I don't think that personally changes the meaning. It just changes our attitude to it. And that's what changes, that's what evolves. So that's what we overcome.
It's always the a priori, but not the thing in itself.
Yes.
That transforms.
Do you want to elaborate on that?
So, should we go back to Frank?
Let's go back to Frankl,
okay.
Yes. Otherwise we're going to get into Lost in Kant.
We can go to Kant in another instance. I have another part of this book that I wanted to talk about, which I found very interesting. The way Frankl portrays the horrors of he endured, not these great horrors, but the things they experienced every day. And he elaborates to one thing that I want to talk with you about, also in relationship to meaning, which is being punished for doing the right thing.
Oh, wow, yeah.
So he outlines a couple of examples where people help each other, let's say, inmates help each other, pick each other up so that they can do more work and that they don't have to go to the gas chambers and whatnot. And then a guard comes and screams at them. And so
there's this massive amount of psychological injustice, I would say, that occurs in that. Frankl actually uses the example, to give a specific example here actually. He outlines this idea, this experience. He was laying track at the railway, and one of his companions had a bust hip or something, and couldn't carry it, so he rushed in to help so that they wouldn't all fall and hurt themselves, and he was reprimanded and beaten for doing so. So but in a sense that doesn't stop them from trying, though, which kind of gravitates to I think what Frankl's highlighting there is humans' capacity to rise despite adversity, despite the notion that you're going to get punished for doing the right thing. It still does it. It still happens.
Yeah, which is, I think, one of the reasons why this book is so beautiful to read, because it's a poem to humanity and to what we can do, even in the direst of circumstances.
Can I raise a trickier point, though? Because I love what you just kind of outlined there. Sort of the human's capability to rise to the top, but what about the human's capability to survive at all costs, even in mundane scenarios? And I'll give you the most mundane scenario of all. It's not mundane, and be very clear here, it's not mundane for the people that were in the concentration camp. But if we look at emperor penguins, for example, in the freezing cold they huddled together for warmth. And Frankl outlines this experience where those at the center are able to remain warm when they're going out for their long marches and that. But then I'm always thinking, well, what about those on the edge? The person in the center is, as mad as it sounds in the circumstances, is in the good spot.
Yep.
The ones on the outer edges are feeling the brunt of that, of the true horror of that experience, the cold in this case. And in a sense, it's almost as if the people who are just trying to survive somehow manage to get into the middle of the pack, essentially. Whether they forced their way into the middle of the pack, I suppose that would create a different distinction, or whether they just were pushed into the middle of the pack. They're still in the middle of the pack. At that moment that the human survival comes at great cost, even if you have no intention. For example, maybe you do want to give up your spot in the middle to somebody else, but at that point you don't have a choice. You don't have the opportunity to. It's a tricky point to make, because I don't want to say that individuals are necessarily struggling for their survival at the cost of others. But I do get the sense there is that happening.
Yeah,
and I think Frankl's clear of that does happen, but it's a tricky one.
I mean, the whole endeavor is so inhumane, and there are so many costs associated with it. Now, if you make it the responsibility of the people in the middle that the people at the edge of the train are going to die, sure. I mean, there is a lot of animalistic behavior going on there. He outlines that as well. The fight for food, for example.
Oh, and the capos as well, the capos, however you want to pronounce them. I suppose that's an interesting study unto itself.
And there is a lot of examples like that in the book. And there is a lot of horrors that the inmates do to each other as well, which is always highlighted. But then there is these moments, and I think that is the nice point of it. There is these moments where people rise above this situation, which is entirely justified. I mean, let's be completely honest. I can't even imagine to be in a situation like that.
No,
if I would be in a situation like that, I can imagine myself very easily shoving somebody to the side to get to the center of the train, right? That is the basic human way of dealing with a situation like that. Now, what makes it so incredibly phenomenal is that is not how people behaved all the time in there.
No, of course.
There is these moments of light, and that is like unimaginable. And I also find it so interesting. If you retell stories like that, nobody cares about the people that behaved out of survival needs. That is not what. If you say you tell this story for educational purposes, that is not what you tell people. What you tell them is about the couple of people that still put the interest of others or of their beliefs or of their purpose above themselves, even in those circumstances. It's like that's what we aspire towards.
Well, it's inspirational at that point, isn't it? Because it shows you, as much as the Holocaust shows the depth of human depravity, it also shows the height of human endeavor to be human.
So I actually have a quote for that, and then we can move on to another topic, or stay on it if you want. But he writes in the book, "Our generation is realistic, for we have come to know man as he really is. After all, man is that being who invented the gas chambers of Auschwitz. However, he's also that being who entered those gas chambers upright, with the Lord's Prayer or the Shema Yisrael on his lips."
Yes, I mean, absolutely.
That covers it, doesn't it?
In a sense, in fact, it's the very last quote at the end of this. "So let us be alert in a twofold sense. Since Auschwitz, we know what man is capable of, and since Hiroshima, we know what is at stake." I think that outlines very clearly in how we must approach the way that we construct our society in due recognition of what humanity is capable of, but also what's at stake.
Right.
Right. I would argue a little bit back on that, though, in a sense that it's not just since Auschwitz that we've known what humanity is capable of. That would be, in many ways, would take away from the historical analysis, sort of the final analysis of human existence. I would say we've always known what humans are capable of. It's just the Holocaust, in a way, it was so amplified and so. To give you an example, a different YouTuber actually described the whole process almost as being like cattle to slaughter.
Yes.
As the way it was represented, because it's so far out that how can humans behave in such another way to other humans? Well, the only way that you can sort of construct that is if they don't look at them as humans anymore.
No, they aren't. That is why I make such a core point about this sanctity of individual humans and not putting the social order first.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or criticizing on the social level.
So it's a complete rejection of Durkheim at that point. Yeah.
Because, okay, fair enough. Because if you dehumanize humans and view them as a cog in the machine, as we discussed it in Brave New World, you lose the humanity. And humans are actually the beings that are at stake. We are the things that are conscious. The social system isn't, right?
Absolutely. I mean, there's a wonderful, if I can find it, gosh, sorry, I have so many, so many quotes. I will say he's endlessly quotable,
yes.
Viktor Frankl. So I've probably lost it here. No, continue. I'll find it.
By the way, if I don't think you can see that, can you hold these kittens in the camera because they look really cool.
These are the only ones I have. So it's for such a harsh book in many ways to have
like baby kittens looking
on it. It's a little bit.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is the quote that I kind of wanted to get to. We saw our naked bodies in the evening. We thought alike. This body here, my body, is really a corpse already. What has become of me? I am but a small portion of a great mass of human flesh, of a mass behind barbed wire, crowded into a few earthen huts, a mass of which daily a certain portion begins to rot because it has become lifeless. I mean, that's that kind of puts it into direct context of how cheap life is in the concentration camp. And Frankl does this a lot, but you know, what this YouTuber that I get back to was kind of making the point, we could never induce that kind of suffering on another conscious being, a being that we actually considered conscious. We could only induce that onto a being that we considered to have no value.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would disagree with that.
Okay, so let me just clarify this.
Yes.
so we're clear on the points we're making.
Yes.
In my position, I am suggesting that humanity is not capable of actually making this kind of this imposition of terror on another human being. I believe human beings essentially are incapable of that.
Of doing such horror.
I believe it's only capable of doing that because it no longer sees another conscious human being or another conscious entity.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you mean something else than what I disagree with, because I can't imagine that you mean that in the same way that I perceive it. Okay. It's like there's a lot of people who kill other people and to do horrible things to other people and who heighten the horror of other people just to make them suffer more because they know about their humanity. They know about what horrifies the conscious experience. Yeah, sorry.
So I will contextualize it even further, which might be useful. So I actually sat in a seminar once where we were talking about murder. Mm-hmm. And the human potential to commit murder, and obviously there's numerous reasons why this can happen. I came up with my position that I adopted in this discussion was that murder is never something that humans are capable of. It is a psychological disorder to murder, in my personal opinion. Mm-hmm. I believe humans are not capable of it. There must be something wrong for you to go and murder someone. Mm-hmm. In the same way, the circumstance must be such for you to commit such acts, mm-hmm. like in the Holocaust, that there is something specifically wrong mm-hmm. there. We're not talking about a human anymore. We could perhaps talk about the Jungian shadow a little bit here mm-hmm. in terms of...
So fundamentally, the human being is, let's say, we propose something like a soul to describe the self of the human, is good, and it can be corrupted. Yeah. And if it gets corrupted, it can do horrible things.
Yes.
But its core is good.
Yes, that's exactly it.
That is basically a Christian
argumentation. It like I say, it would have a theological context to it.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with that.
Right.
I don't disagree with that. I don't know if it's true because but it would be great if it would be true.
I mean, in a sense, I mean, it's not just Christian, obviously. It goes back to Confucian and the Zhuangzi, for example, and Taoism, this immense, sort of, if you're talking in the more Eastern traditions, this notion of evil. And sort of there was between Confucian ethics, there was this idea of whether humans are entirely good or whether humans are evil. Mm-hmm. And there's still a disagreement now as to whether people believe humans are become good mm-hmm. through their experiences, or whether we're just born good and become corrupted through their experiences. I don't know what your take on that is specifically.
So I will bring it back to the book.
If we contextualize it perhaps with the capos.
Yes.
Were the capos born evil people? Or did the circumstance make them evil? So just for clarification, the capos were individuals within the concentration camps who were prisoners themselves, but had been given greater rights. And Frankl actually describes them sometimes behaving worse than the guards themselves.
Yes.
So they're prisoners themselves, but they've been given specific roles to play within that prison. So in a sense, are they just evil people?
Mm-hmm.
So would that inherently say that they're just evil from the outright, or is it the circumstance that has made them evil?
Well, that is a very deep conversation about free will, decision making, and how one becomes who one is. That I am not really qualified to get into.
Well, let's see what Frankl says, because he actually.
So Frankl. So I would scaffold it around that, because Frankl makes an argument that is analogous to something I've heard before, which is like, if people commit evil, or if people sin in the Christian sense, right? Sin specifically, they miss the intended goal. They miss the purpose of what they are supposed to be doing. They miss the meaning. Right. They are not nailing it. So this, I don't know. I think it is from another YouTuber as well, that the word sin actually derives from the Greek term hamartia, which means to miss the target.
Yeah.
On a to miss the target with a bow. So it's sort of, they are not doing what they're supposed to be doing, and by this deviation of how they are supposed to act, all of the horrible things flood in that are considered evil. Yeah. And so I think Frankl sees this in a somewhat similar manner, because he outlines that the people who nail the meaning, who find the meaning for themselves, whether they die in the concentration camps or whether they survive, they don't do things like that. They do things that are worth aspiring towards by other human beings, right? I don't know if that makes sense, but sort of how I would try to elaborate.
That makes actually perfect sense. It's the idea of missing the target. So this would, in many ways, take a Platonic sense, that good is the inherency of all beings.
Right. So perfection is the
Frankl mentions another word actually, which again to repeat myself, he's endlessly quotable, but there is one particular thing I found deeply moving actually that he writes in here. And I'll just read it, because the salvation of man is through love and in love. I understood how a man who has nothing left in this world still may know bliss, be it only for a brief moment, in the contemplation of his beloved, in a position of utter desolation, when man cannot express himself in positive action, when his only achievement may consist in enduring his sufferings in the right way, an honourable way. In such a position, man can, through loving contemplation of the image he carries of his beloved, achieve fulfillment. So, I mean, I agree with him almost completely in that sentence, but it's very much an Augustinian tradition. So Augustine has this wonderful saying, love and do what you will. In other words, it doesn't matter what you do as long as you love. When you're able to love, then everything falls into place. Yeah. So in a sense, that's very much like hitting the mark.
Yes.
As long as you are aiming for that mark, it doesn't really matter what you do as long as you as long as you hit it, kind of, then everything is fine. So do you think, for example, that love is the most powerful drive in this sense?
I don't know. I mean, it would be great. I mean, from a Christian perspective and out of a Christian tradition, it is the core principle of the New Testament.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
Love.
Yeah.
So there definitely must be something to it. I mean, not in the sense that everything that is written in religious text
No,
is
of
correct,
course,
but
yeah.
obviously there's a lot of thought that goes into texts like that and statements like that. So there's obviously a deep reality to that. I would try to reframe love in the context of the self-overcoming motif in Viktor
Yeah.
Frankl and in Nietzsche.
Because he's not talking about a biological perspective
No.
of love. He's clear that, again, when we were talking about free will, Frankl is very much wanting to distance himself from this idea of a biological constructivist
Yeah.
perspective of free will.
Yeah.
He believes that in many ways man is free. That's his outline. I'm not going to go into why I disagree with that specifically, but I do appreciate where he's coming from.
Definitely, it's a very powerful statement.
yes.
And it's also like the whole free will thing, I always find from a pragmatic perspective, it's very useful to think, if I have free will, right, I can make my own decisions and I have control over what I'm doing. So what is more useful to think? That I have control over what I'm doing, or that I don't because I'm a deterministic machine that runs on my brain's fuels?
So directly I agree with you, but as a philosopher I have to deconstruct things. So
No, fair enough.
it's my... So I would argue, how much free will did these individuals actually have within the camp itself?
Well,
Their entire daily life is almost dictated to them.
That and I think you made the point right there. Within the camp,
Yes.
within the circumstances that the environment dictates them, they had a choice to roam free, even though it was tried to be suppressed as much as possible. And I think there's few places, if one reads about them, like the concentration camp, like there is no place where human beings were as put into a very small position
Yeah.
and maneuvered in that small position as in the concentration camps. But still, and that's the message of the book, individuals roam free for that.
I agree on principle, but Frankl uses a chess analogy. I'm going to use one. It's very much like if you were to start a game of chess and somebody has moved a bunch of the pieces for you already, and now you sat down, and now you can argue you have free choice to make whatever you want in
Yes.
that game. I would actually say no, you don't, because at the end of the day, you might have free choice to make the decisions, but so many of the decisions have already been made for you. In a sense, the circumstances of the camp, so many of the decisions have already been represented that one could argue maybe then it's your only choice is to do evil, or to, in a sense, to fight for your survival, play the numbers game, essentially. Or maybe you do rise to do this great sense of humanity. How much of that is free, I'm not certain.
Well,
I'm not arguing in the sense of a biological, purely deterministic perspective here. I just think it's very difficult to say at what point do we say it's free. We can never fully identify, oh, now it's free at this point, or it's free at that point. I don't necessarily see it as being that easy.
it never is. Like we talked about this last week regarding the social order of things in Brave New
Yeah.
World. It's like you always have a game, you always have a frame of reference, and
Yeah.
the magnitude to which people make moves for you is not the thing that's relevant. You know, relevant at the end of the day is that you make your move. And the game
Or
of
not.
chess in and of it, or not, right, or not, but you make the conscious decision. It's like the game of chess in and of itself, even if nobody moves for you, is
Yeah.
extremely restricted. You can only make a certain kind of
Yeah,
move.
yeah,
You
absolutely.
can't move however you want with your how are they called, the minions.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't really play chess that
In Germany
well.
they're called
Yeah.
peasants, but
Yeah.
I don't think that's the English term for it.
Pawns.
Pawns,
Yeah.
thank you. But it's like you're always a little bit, or not only a little bit, you're very limited. You're
Yeah.
biologically limited, you're intellectually
Yeah,
limited,
absolutely.
you're societally limited, like all that
And
kind of
Frankl's
stuff.
clear that he acknowledges all of that, but he's a bit like you're outlining, he's acknowledging there is this opportunity
To rise.
to rise.
And right, and this is so interesting. It also relates again to the hero mythology, but if we look at cinema, like Slumdog Millionaire, for example.
Right, yeah.
Right.
I've never watched it, but yeah.
A classic example of it. Somebody who rises against the
Yeah.
odds of his deterministic environment and becomes something great. It's like, that is the story we tell. That is the thing that gives us meaning when we see it in other people. So, coming back to, is meaning constructed, interpretative, or is it objective? It's like, that's exactly where the subjective and the objective meet. You have this point where a certain kind of living is the thing that is aspired towards, but the context of it can shift indeterminately. So I don't know what you say
So
to that.
I've almost, when it comes to free will, I've always had an odd relationship with it, and I've always used an analogy to describe my position on it. I'm describing it now because I think it might be useful for context. To me, it's like a magician. When we go watch a magician, we know we're watching an illusion. We're not in any denial that what we're seeing is not real magic, in a sense. But the magic itself is actually real. It really is happening. And in many ways, I find that is how I treat free will. I look at it as being an illusion. I don't think we're actually ever fully capable of it. But the illusion itself is real. So does that maybe help usefully contextualize it a bit?
Yes. I mean, yeah, we could have a discussion about free will. In the last analysis, I don't think it's that...
Perhaps I'll give it a different way, because
Yes.
Frankl uses love as an example.
Yes.
And to me, as I mentioned, that's sort of the most powerful image I took from the entire book, was this, that you are even able to love. Whether it's the love of his beloved wife or the love of humanity, to rise on the foundations of love, if you like. It's such a powerful image. But in many ways, to love is to give up freedom. And a theological perspective of that, within marriage, for example, the two become one. That's a very, very big symbol within biblical narrative, but also outside of biblical narrative as well, the idea of being knotted together.
Plato's circle humans.
Yeah, absolutely. But in a sense, that's giving up free will.
Yes.
So I would argue that as a final analysis, free will only exists when you're actually willing to give it up. Otherwise, it doesn't really exist. You're always you're always creating a hypothetical scenario of where free will exists. It only exists once the action has already happened, and now you go back and analyze it and go, was that really free actually? Sorry, I've got that the wrong way around. It only happens in the event. When you post-analyze it, it's very unclear whether it's free. So in terms of Frankl's description of love and the rising into humanity, the height of that rising is giving up the free will. It's not saying, oh, the people that stood up for themselves, stood up for their free will, were the ones that died at the very beginning.
The people that followed their meaning, followed a narrative that was written for them.
Yeah.
They didn't follow their free will, but they made the conscious decision to follow that. It's like, I can relate to this again quite well. When I fell in love, you can make a lot of arguments as to why you should be reserved about this. At least I can. I was able to make a lot of arguments to say, listen, actually, be a little bit skeptical here and be a little bit cynical here and be a little bit careful here and take all of this into context and don't be stupid. I'm able to say that, but I made the conscious effort to say, no, I'm still taking the leap of faith, as
Absolutely.
Kierkegaard would say it.
Yes, yeah.
And fall into something that is then not determined by just me freely anymore.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, that's such a powerful statement of Kierkegaard, the leap of faith.
The leap
and
of
I think
faith,
that's
yeah.
what Frankl's identifying, this leap of faith.
Yes.
To find meaning, you have to take a leap of faith.
yes.
And that's where I'm in full agreement with Frankl, actually. I don't think meaning is just going to sit there and present itself to you and go, here I am. You do need to take that leap of faith. And I think the individuals that sort of, for whatever reason, rose to the surface in this concentration camp took the leap of faith.
I wanted to deconstruct and reconstruct a specific idea of meaning that I had associated with this book, and see what you think about it. So imagine that there is this meaning that you can search for, and that you sort of try to conjure up and construct. But imagine that there is a different meaning, the meaning of something that represents something beyond itself, like everything. So for example, if you have a bear, so your brain constructs the environment around you, we know that, right, to some extent. So it simplifies all of the input that is coming, and it tries to take the meaningful,
and articulates it the best way it can.
In the second stage, articulate it, but it tries to take information, operate on a limited data set, and then get good outputs, if we take a classic information approach. Well, what is the meaning of a predator, like for example a lion? The lion automatically has a meaning. You don't need to construct that. You don't need to find that. Your brain tells you the meaning of the lion as soon as you see it. And that is, I need to get away. I am scared. Your hair stand up and all of that. And I need to get as much meters between me and that animal as possible. It's like, that is not a second-hand construction. So what if we have a relationship like that with our path through life? What if it shines forth at us and captures us, and if we actually pay attention to it and don't ignore it like we wouldn't ignore a lion, it would be able to actually shine forth from the objective world?
I'm just pausing because I'm taking that in. So there's numerous analogies they could use for this, but the one that I'm particularly fond of is like putting a lamp. I used it earlier a bit, but you put a lamp in a room and then you put a cloth over the lamp, in a sense. The light shining, you just have a cloth over it, because the light hasn't gone away. So in a sense, meaning's always present. If I'm understanding you correctly, a bit like the light, the meaning's always there.
Yes.
It's just you need to be receptive, to become receptive, to find that meaning, in a sense.
Yes.
Well, in a sense, you don't have to find it, it's there already. You just have to be receptive to it, to allow it to find you.
Yes.
In the same way that you're not going... the lion example is very interesting. All right, I haven't actually been face-to-face with a lion, but I got face-to-face with a coyote in the wild, for example, which is really interesting because this thing stood about as big as a wolf to me, and it was like, I'm literally on my own, I'm standing in front of it, and I'm like, this is an alpha male, and I'm already like, okay, what do I do now? And it was at that point I made the conscious decision not to run, actually, and to just stare it down, not in an alpha male sense at all, but in a sense to go like, okay, what now? And it kind of, just went off in its way. It probably would have been a very different scenario if it was at night, by the way, because this was during the day. They tend to be a bit more placid during the day than on their hunt mode. But so maybe that was the right decision to do. But anyway, that's entirely aside. But I think you're right. We tend to overanalyze, in a sense, rather than just allow meaning to arrive to us. Because in a sense, okay, to put it in context of logotherapy, for example, is this overanalysis of meaning, is this helpful? Or does this present meaning serendipitous meaning arriving to you? So by accident, for example. I know we don't necessarily think of accident as, in this way, might be a bit odd, but in a sense, going out rather than looking for meaning, just to take what comes. Is that sort of where you're going with that?
So obviously so if you don't look for something, you're not going to find it, right?
Exactly.
So you need to know that there is something that can actually grab you. You need to be educated to that part, which a lot of people who are in extreme psychological distress aren't anymore. They have a lot of... so I'm obviously not only oversimplifying, but speaking out of my
area of expertise.
To
an extent, yeah.
You have like a lot of schemas and of interactions with the environment that don't work anymore. You have a lot of routines that don't work anymore, and all of this causes you a lot of psychological distress because you're not living up to the thing that your correction center in the brain, which is measuring how you're dealing with the environment, is telling you that you're doing a very bad job of it. And all of that, if you make people aware of that is actually what's happening, which logotherapy in part is about, making people aware that there are actually things they can do to change this feeling, which is a center of a lot of therapeutic approaches. You don't then go out and search and interpret meaning into everything that you see, but you try to be a little bit more attentive. So for example, as to previously, when one of your parents has called and wanted to check on you, you sort of understood it as an annoyance because, I don't know, you're taking drugs and you don't want to interact with your parents or something. You now take the chance and you're like, all right, maybe I can actually have a meaningful relationship with one of my parents. Maybe I can share with them, tell them what's going on. They can help me, I can help them, and we can make our whole community a little bit better. Like, that is realizing a meaning in the very moment. You don't need to interpret that. Like, it comes right at you with the call.
It's almost being mindful, in a sense, if we to use a Buddhist term, so mindfulness. So,
which is also very trendy.
Well.
But it's all
it comes and goes, I would say. If you look at sort of going, well, no, that's going to get lost. Sorry, it's the religious studies person in me.
No, we have in the psychology department, we have people researching mindfulness at the moment.
It's a fascinating area. It's one I'm particularly interested in, actually. That and consciousness and ontology. But anyway, I would agree. I do think, on final analysis, I don't think meaning is something that's abstract. I think it does exist for you. And if one is attentive, it will. You don't necessarily have to go out in search of meaning. Though I can certainly appreciate those that do, because it's usually a case when that happens, the individual they're in a trauma of some sort, whether that is a physical, a mental, or a spiritual trauma. I would sort of put those into three categories. It may require a very, very specific and direct, right, we need to take full stop and go in search of this meaning. But in the majority of time, I'd say meaning just represents itself, and it is whether we are attentive to it. I think that's how you're presenting it.
Sort of.
There does now raise a problem that I wanted to get onto now.
Perfect.
It's representing meaning into transitory things. So again, this would be a Buddhist way of thinking. I'm not a Buddhist, by the way, but I appreciate the way of thinking. When we put meaning into things that are, in a sense, transitory. So, for example, someone wants to become a YouTuber, right? So they put all their endeavor, all their effort to become a YouTuber. Let's just hypothetically say YouTube doesn't really last that long, and just as for hypothesis, YouTube dies in a few years and something else comes along and takes over it. So you've put all that meaning, all that purpose, all that effort into something that is essentially not going to last. So in Descartes kind of describes this as man's attempt to find something greater than himself, or ourselves, and place meaning into that. And to direct meaning. So I wanted to say meaning in two parts. You have the mundanity of meaning, and I don't mean that derogatory, I just mean that in the sense that we construct our meaning within a context. But to go back to what I said earlier, you have this greater than yourself meaning. So in other words, a meaning that isn't just transitory, a meaning that isn't predicated upon things that can change and do change.
Yes, and I think that the meaning that is constructed about things that are changing, like for example aspiring to become a YouTuber, those things, they aim towards something beyond them, which is the thing that doesn't move, which is the spirit of self-overcoming in some real sense, I think. So why do you want to become a YouTuber? Well, there can be 1,000 reasons for that.
Of course,
but we can peel these layers back, right? We can say, well, because I want to have influence. Why do you want to have influence? Well, I want to become recognized for who I am, or that I'm a good
maybe you want to do good, whatever it is.
You want to do a good. I want to be a good person. I want to have a good life. I want to have something that lasts. Like, you can scaffold all of these points around them. In the last analysis, you want to overcome your humanity. You want to point to something beyond, and that is the immovable stuff that meaning is made of.
So in a sense, this is almost the self-enlightenment. You want to self-improve.
Right, perfect.
Yeah.
Self-overcoming, self-enlightenment.
So this is where I've always had a fascination with sort of the mystical side of existence, because a lot of it has been represented as this idea of becoming God almost. So you want to become godlike. There's lots of religions that practice that kind of thinking. But in a sense, how can you arrive at that without discovering the self? Think of Aristotle, or know thyself. I mean, we're not actually sure whether Aristotle actually said that or stole that, or whether it's been misappropriated to him. Doesn't matter, it's a great saying. Mm-hmm. Know thyself. And how does one know thyself unless one has actually,
done something.
Exactly. And in a sense, experienced yourself, both the good and the bad.
Yes.
And
absolutely.
in a sense, how does one actually self-improve if you don't know what you have to improve upon? And in many ways, to contextualize this with Frankl, Frankl's own personal experiences within the Holocaust. And I do like the fact that Frankl actually mentions at the very start of the book that it's almost impossible to do a project like he's written here without instituting bias into it. He's fully recognizing that it is his experience, his biases upon this, because it's an individual experience at the end of the day. So in a sense, Frankl has clearly self-improved to whatever extent, he's written his book.
Which is insane to think about.
And clearly the individuals, and again, this would be an interesting perspective, even the individuals who went through, who maybe weren't such nice people in these camps, is there room for their self-improvement upon final analysis when they recognize what they have done, perhaps?
Mm-hmm.
In many ways, it's like the alcoholic who can't really overcome alcoholism unless they recognize that they are actually an alcoholic. Mm-hmm. So you can't really self-improve unless you know what you're improving. Mm-hmm. And so the self-enlightenment, know thyself, I think is so important. I don't know whether you have something to attach onto that, or is that...
No, I think that is a very, very good point. Like the recognition that there is something to improve upon.
Where do we get that from?
Exactly, but I would just stress the point of how important it is. Where we get that from, we come that in a moment. But there was a very famous member of Adolf Hitler's inner circle called Albert Speer.
Yeah.
Who was...
He's the architect.
He did a lot of architecture for Hitler, and he planned his Germania capital city and all his grandeur plans of insanity that man had.
Yes.
And when they were sitting in the trials of Nuremberg for the war criminals, most of the criminals there downplayed what happened, or sort of didn't really recognize, didn't want to accept, couldn't accept, didn't take responsibility for what happened. So you had Göring, the flight commander, who basically put it back to the audience and the law and said, well, what a hypocritical...
Which is the one that committed suicide?
Yeah, he committed suicide later on, before he got hanged. Yeah. Well, anyways, Albert Speer stood up and acknowledged all of the mistakes and said that there is an experience here that we can learn from. Now, obviously, there's a lot of controversy around those statements because historians discuss, and rightfully so, whether there was... whether if he just acted
whether
like
it was sincere,
whether if it was sincere or not. He got 25 years in prison or something, but that is not the point that I'm making. I don't want to get into whether Albert Speer actually understood what he was saying. He still played the card that there is something to learn from this experience, and we need to incorporate this into how we are going to interact with each other in the future. And that is the point he was making when being in a law room for the most historic lawsuit of human history, right? That is the case he made. He said, let's take something of value out of this and remember all of the things that we failed to do with horror. And so that resonated deeply with people. They didn't hang him, you know, and it seems to hit something in us, right? The self-overcoming, right?
I think it's such it is the seminal point, the overcoming of the self.
And if we look into therapy, it's the seminal point of most therapeutic approaches. Whether you're a psychoanalyst or a logotherapist, it's always about moving beyond what you are at the moment, right? And,
so I would have a minor question in terms of that, because I'm not actually that familiar with the psychotherapeutical approaches. How much impetus is put on future change rather than dealing with so in other words, if you're just going to push your problems into the future, I'll become a better person by doing these things in the future. I recognize the importance of doing that, but at the same time, what about changing the here and now?
Yeah, so obviously different approaches have different emphasis. So psychodynamic approach is very past oriented, so it tries to learn from the past for the present. Cognitive behavioral therapy, I think, is most of what you are interested in if you think about immediate change, because it tries to give people schemes to interact with the environment, little things, in a more positive way in day-to-day life. But all of them in the end try to do that, you know, like if you go to a logotherapy session, the therapist, I don't think at least, is going to tell you, well, you can do that next week.
No, not at all.
We're doing this now. We're changing now.
Yes.
Okay,
so that in that term, there's benefit to be had. Anything that is, I mean, recently lots of people have had critiques, various different types of critiques, and coming around psychology and specifically. But I always come down to this perspective: anything that helps you to develop this idea of self-improvement, that can't be a bad thing.
No, probably not.
I guess as a final point to round off on this, where do we get the inclination to change? Does it come from within us, or is this something that is external to us?
Well, I think that is a whole different discussion that we should have, but I think fundamentally it's biologically hardwired into the existence of sentient beings. The becoming. I think that Nietzsche and him as well nail that, and particularly Nietzsche because he's one of the philosophers that I've read more, but the constant overcoming, I would say. What do you think?
I agree to a sense. I would say we are predisposed to gravitate towards good. However we want to construe what we mean by that, that would be debatable, of course, and very much interpretive. But I believe that is where we all want to go towards.
Yes.
And in a sense, that's where our inclination comes from to rise, even in the most horrific of circumstances, like Frankl's outlining of the concentration camp. So that's where I would sort of end on, really.
No, that's a really good ending. I think today's discussion was about the book, but it was also very philosophical.
Absolutely. That's probably my fault a bit.
Because,
no, it's not. I mean, just for everyone, I don't know whether you can see it, there are a lot of kittens on this book right now, because I had there are two books here, in my opinion. There is the initial discussion of Frankl about the concentration camp, which in my opinion should almost be compulsory reading in many cases.
Yes.
I think I can see a lot of value. There's a lot of discussionary points students could have, or even just individuals interested in this kind of thing. The second part is more technical in terms. So again, very interesting, but for a different reason for me. So that's why there's so many notes in there.
But yeah.
Do we have a book for the next occasion?